Hello, my name is Lizzie Karen, and welcome to my channel on Atlantis. In case you're new to my channel, I'll just give you a quick overview of what it's all about. It's basically a record of the regressive dreams that I've had all my life. These are really interesting dreams, and they're of a past life of a place called Tantal, or what I believe to be Atlantis. The technology that I saw was amazing, but it's very, very different to what we have today. And I've described much of this technology in earlier episodes. But the technology that I'll be talking about today involves technology of war. And once again, very different to the sort of technology that we see in war today. So this is a war between Tantal and Neith. And it's very interesting to note that Plato also described a war between these two places, but he called them Atlantis and Athens. So this is the war between Atlantis and Athens. Because of my episodes on the history of Atlantis, many people have asked about the war that I mentioned in those episodes between Atlantis and Athens. Firstly, at the time, Atlantis obviously was called Tantal, and Athens was called Neith. And Neith was mostly destroyed at the time of the Great Deluge, but was later rebuilt and became Athens. But that's another story. To understand the background of the war, you do need to watch both episodes on history on my channel. So if you find those, you'll find a lot more detail about how it came to this point. But in a nutshell, Tantal had a leader that was a megalomaniac, narcissistic, self-absorbed, pompous, basically an a-hole with an extreme superiority complex. But he was very charismatic, good-looking in a most unusual sort of way, and he had a certain presence, je ne sais quoi. So essentially, he was an attractive, pathological egotist with a god complex. This wasn't so noticeable at the start of his reign, but as time progressed, he became more and more demanding of his people. He was more and more neglectful of them, and worst of all, he was excessively cruel. He decided he was a god and wanted everyone to worship him. The people acted as he wished, and many temples were built at this point in time. I never saw any of that. I wasn't in Tantal when that happened. Then he decided that the whole world had to worship him, not just the people of Tantal. And so he started to attack and conquer the primitive settlements nearby, and he got further and further afield. So, as one would expect, many of the people living in Tantal did their best to escape. But Japan had an exceptional police, or should I say military, so rather a lot of them ended up dead. And by that I mean dead. He would prefer his people dead rather than living elsewhere. Those who escaped went to either a location in Italy, where the previous leader, Bela, was living. Of course, it wasn't called Italy in those days. Or they went to live in Neith, which became Athens. Japan conquered more locations of primitives, converting some of the people into his military, and the rest to worship him in his new religion. Eventually, he decided to move his forces towards the areas where the escaped Tantals had gone. His forces began to attack the Mediterranean by sea through the Straits of Gibraltar, working eastwards. It was in about 11,570 BC when the force reached the northern part of the area known today as Italy. The people of Tantal who had escaped that area decided that they needed to join forces and defend themselves. No matter if they'd been supporters of the first leader, Uran, the second leader, Belah, or if they had at one stage been followers of Japay, it didn't matter, they all joined forces. This had all gone way too far, so they joined forces together and reunited as one. Uran even came out of retirement and provided the mechanisms and technology for the defense of their area. As Japay's forces neared Neath, they were ready and they sat quietly and waited. I was one of those in Neath who waited. It was a weird feeling because it was nice to be working with my brother Uran out in the real world and have Bella with us. And Uran and Bella were getting on absolutely fabulously by this stage. Well, after all, they were father and son. And they had made their peace some time ago. But to actually see it was really, really wonderful. And it was also a good feeling, that feeling of being united with people from Tantal of all different eras. And they were all essentially from different cultures, because the different time frames within Tantal were very, very different in so many ways. And yet we all joined together as one group. And that was really quite nice. So there we were, all together, like united siblings, protecting ourselves from a bad parent. Japay's force eventually attacked. They looked menacingly for quite a while, trying to spook us or maybe to see if we'd made the first move, which we didn't. They made their first move by sending a glowing ball through the air aimed directly at the center of Neath. It was launched from one of their boats. It should be noted that at this time, the technology of Japay's Tantal was neither as impressive, nor beautiful, nor environmentally friendly as that of Uran's or even Belah's. It was definitely more clumsy, very destructive, and resource wasteful. But that's another thing. Anyway, they still had some of the residual technology of the old days, plus they had their new technology that they developed without any ethical concerns. And of course, this was some of that new technology. So this glowing ball was launched. It moved in an arch towards us, much in the same way that a cannonball would approach its target. I assume from this approach that the weapon neither used targeting technology nor did it have its own mechanism for flight. Anyway, the glowing ball thing, it flew towards us through the air, and of course we were terrified. Despite the reassurances of Uran, we nevertheless huddled together as we watched, and when it appeared above us, it seemed to just hit something invisible. And it went straight back to where it came from. As it hit the water from where it was launched, it exploded with enormous force. If the attackers who'd launched it hadn't moved their boat after launching the device, then when it had come back, it would simply have destroyed them. The strikes that came later were not as fortunate as the first boat, since some of them didn't move and were in the same location when the device returned to them. But they soon learned to move away quickly once they'd launched. They tried launching at different angles and to different locations within Neath, but the result was the same. And the closer they got to the launch, the less time they had to get away. So they learned that lesson really quickly as well. They bombarded us for about 6 hours initially. Then they stopped and waited. They waited for a few days, and then they started again. I don't know if they needed to get more supplies or if they were trying to tweak the weapons or what. But after a few days, the bombardment resumed. This time it was more paced, 1 per hour approximately, and aimed at one specific location, maybe trying to create a weakness. This continued day and night for weeks. It is difficult to sleep through it. But we did have the resources, food and water, etc., to last us out indefinitely, so they weren't able to use that technique of waiting us out, or should I say starving us out. But they certainly made the whole thing very unpleasant. Because of the lack of sleep, we started to take turns going into one of our underground storage chambers in order to get away from the noise and get some sleep. There was a vertical shaft from our main building that went deep underground, and it was well ventilated. And it was where we kept our technology till we needed it, plus all our various resources. So we set up a few beds and we took turns sleeping down there, and that worked quite well. After weeks and weeks of this treatment, it suddenly stopped. They continued to lurk, however, and we continued to watch them. They seemed to be waiting for something. After about a month or so of this lurking, they sent some flying devices over us, but nothing actually happened. I guess they were just sussing us out. One of them got quite brave and tried to get close, but as soon as they reached a certain distance, they couldn't get any closer, no matter how much they tried. And then quite weirdly, it all went very quiet for months. The lurkers were still there, and they would occasionally get replaced by new troops who would just continue to sit there and lurk. But the next attack came from the sky. And to say that it was comical is an understatement. So they arrived in small flying machines, carrying large buckets of a strange sticky substance. There was about 10 of these flying machines, and they each got into a position over the top of us that was equally spaced, and in unison they dumped their buckets of goo. They clearly did not expect the goo to be returned to them, and so they didn't move. And as they were so close to our boundary at the time, the goo returned to them very quickly. First of all, it splattered as it hit our boundary, then bounced back, retaining its splatter pattern to hit the machines from underneath and wrapping the goo around the whole machine, covering both the participants, the machines, and their propulsion mechanisms. They still had their devices for levitation, so they were still floating there, but they weren't able to go anywhere except by reducing their buoyancy. So they had to get towed by a functional flying machine. It was hilarious to see them limp off. It all went quiet again for a very long time, actually, except for the lurkers. They were constantly there, lurking. We assumed that Junpei was watching remotely, maybe by comm device, rather than in person, because we didn't see him or feel his presence, as we so often joked. Occasionally, they sent a flying device, probably with one of their scientists, over the top of us to prod at our boundary and do the odd test. Uran found this hilarious also. But the rest of us, well, we didn't quite get the joke. It must have been one of his special scientific jokes. Anyway, they kept trying different things, including aiming a very large-looking mirror thing at us. But nothing they tried worked. It took about 5 years or so of intermittent warfare of a variety of different kinds, and of course their visits of curiosity, before Japay withdrew even what was left of the lurkers. I was told later that Japay only intended to withdraw temporarily until his scientists found a solution, but other things conspired to prevent that from ever happening, and so Athens essentially beat Atlantis in the War of Japay, which is what we called it. We called it the War of Japay. To find out more about what was going on in Tantal at that time, you'd need to go to the episodes on the history of Tantal. And that's what happened in the war between Atlantis and Athens, and how Athens won. So once again, thank you all for listening and going with me on this journey through my dreams. And if you know of anyone else who you think might find this interesting, please introduce my channel to them. You'd be doing both of us an enormous favor, I think. And I'll catch you all in the next episode. Bye.